Amara Collins had always believed that life unraveled loudly, that heartbreak announced itself with slammed doors, smashed glasses, and the kind of screaming that tore open a soul. She had seen those endings play out in friends' apartments, in the whispered aftermath of rushed brunch confessions, in her mother's steady reminders that love is a beautiful thing until it isn't. But on the night of her 35th birthday, heartbreak arrived differently, quietly, like a shadow slipping under a locked door. Chicago's late autumn wind pushed against the glass of the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive as Amara stepped out of the elevator, her coat draped over one arm, a soft exhaustion in her bones. The city glittered below, cold, electric, indifferent, but she had come home early with a fragile thread of hope tugging at her ribs. Tonight, Evan had promised. Dinner at 8, just us. I owe you something special. She'd read the note twice that morning, smiling in spite of herself. In spite of the months of distance, in spite of the muted ache she'd taught herself to live with. She had allowed herself, foolishly perhaps, to imagine a small turning point, a candlelit table, laughter, a warmth she had not felt in far too long. The hallway was dim, washed in a soft amber glow from the sconces. Amara moved through it with the quiet grace of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long and was finally ready to set it down. She slipped the key card into the lock and pushed the door open. The sound met her instantly. Not loud, never loud, but unmistakable. A laugh. A woman's. Light, breathy, drifting from the bedroom as though carried by the same air that froze Amara where she stood. Her fingers tightened around her coat. No, she must have imagined it. But then, Evan's voice, low and intimate, threaded through the space. Close. Too close. Close in the way he hadn't been with her in, she couldn't remember how long. A strange calm spread over her skin, the kind that arrived before earthquakes and after terrible news, the body's way of preparing itself for impact. Amara didn't move. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. Instead, she inhaled once, deeply, letting the truth burn its way down her throat. Her boots had been pinching her all day. Without looking away from the dark corridor leading to the master bedroom, she bent down, unzipped them slowly, and stepped out. First one, then the other, bare feet on chilled hardwood. The shock of it steadied her. She rested her hand against the wall to keep her balance. Not because she was weak, but because the world had tilted a fraction to the left, and her body needed a moment to catch up. A soft thud echoed from the bedroom. A murmur. Sheets shifting, a gasp that did not belong to her. Her heartbeat did not race. It went eerily still, an animal hiding, waiting, listening. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself hope for another explanation. Perhaps Evan was rehearsing a speech, talking to the television, on a call with one of his reckless partners who laughed too loudly at everything. Perhaps. But she wasn't a woman who lived on, perhaps. She was an architect. Her life was built on precision, angles, measurements, truths that did not wobble under pressure. And the truth was breathing in her bedroom. Amara took one step forward, then another. Not toward the room, but toward the answer she already knew she wasn't ready for. Her reflection caught briefly in the hallway mirror. A woman in a burgundy dress chosen to be loved in. Curls she had pinned with care, lips she'd softened with gloss in case tonight finally tasted sweet again. The sight pierced her, but she didn't flinch. Something inside her, something old and powerful, lifted its head. Not rage, not heartbreak, not yet. Clarity. She pressed her fingertips against her sternum, feeling the faint tremor beneath her skin, and exhaled a quiet, steadying breath that felt like the beginning of something she couldn't name. The wind outside howled against the windows, as if the city itself knew a life had just cracked open in a single, silent moment. Amara straightened. She did not call out his name. She did not march toward the room. She did not break. Not here, not yet. Instead, she turned toward Evan's office, toward the truth she feared, and the strength she did not yet know she possessed. Because sometimes the end begins softly. Sometimes it begins with a sound you cannot unhear. Sometimes it begins with a woman removing her boots in the dark, preparing, without knowing, for the rest of her life. And if you feel yourself holding your breath alongside her, stay with this story. Like, comment, or follow. Your support helps bring the next chapters to life. There is so much more waiting beneath the quiet. The morning had begun with light, soft, golden, almost indulgent in the way it spilled across the penthouse floor, as though it too wished Amara Collins a happy birthday. Chicago's skyline rose beyond the glass like a cathedral of steel, the city already humming awake, unaware of the promise stitched into her day. Amara woke slowly, as she always did on mornings when hope felt possible. She stretched beneath the linen sheets, the quiet warmth of the room wrapping around her like an embrace she'd stopped expecting from the man she shared it with. And then she saw it. A note, folded once, placed on the pillow beside her. Her breath caught, not dramatically, but in the soft, startled way a heart reacts when it has been waiting too long for something gentle. The note was written in Evan's unmistakable handwriting, bold strokes softened by a slight tilt, a script that once made her cheeks burn the way only early love could. Dinner at 8, just us. Happy birthday, A. E. She traced the letter E with her thumb, feeling that small flutter of warmth she had missed more than she dared to say aloud. There had been a time when Evan's notes filled their home, taped to coffee mugs, slipped into the pocket of her blazer, hidden in the blueprint tube she carried to work. They had been reminders of a sweetness that lived in the spaces between their ambitions. That sweetness had faded. But here it was again, resurrected in ink. Amara pressed the note to her chest for a brief, foolish second before placing it carefully on her nightstand. She sat up, letting the sunlight touch her face, and allowed herself, just for today, to imagine the possibility of a rekindled spark. She showered, letting warm water loosen the tightness in her shoulders. As she washed, she tried to remember the last time she and Evan had spoken without the conversation drifting into logistics. Meetings, flights, maintenance schedules for the penthouse. She remembered 1,000 practical exchanges and almost no tender ones. It stung, but she swallowed the ache. Today would be different. She wanted to believe that. After dressing in soft lounge pants, she padded barefoot into the kitchen. The marble countertop gleamed. The coffee machine blinked dutifully at her. Amara prepared her favorite roast, savoring the scent that filled the room. A dark, earthy aroma that reminded her of her grandmother's home in Georgia, where mornings were unhurried and full of small rituals. She took the first sip and closed her eyes. Warm, comforting, steadying. Her phone buzzed with birthday messages. Layla, her closest friend, brunch this weekend. You, me, pancakes, and a shameful amount of syrup. Her mother, happy birthday, baby. Don't forget who you are and what you deserve. Her younger brother, Marcus, a voice memo singing off-key. Amara laughed quietly to herself. But the message she searched for wasn't there. Not yet. Evan rarely texted her in the mornings anymore. He claimed mornings were sacred productivity hours. But today, she hoped for something small. A heart emoji, a good morning, birthday girl, even a simple, thinking of you. Nothing came. Still, she granted him grace. Tonight, he had written. Tonight would matter. She dressed for work with deliberate care. Not to impress Evan, not anymore, but because she had begun to understand that the only validation she could rely on was the kind she gave herself. She chose a cream silk blouse, tailored charcoal slacks, and earrings shaped like little arcs, reminders of the curves she designed into the buildings she imagined. In the mirror, her reflection looked composed, elegant, capable. But beneath the surface was a woman trying not to want too much. A rideshare carried her through the city streets, past the familiar blend of grit and glitter that Chicago wore like a dual identity. She watched pedestrians race the crosswalk lights, couples sharing croissants, an older man feeding pigeons from a brown paper bag. Ordinary rituals that somehow looked softer today. Her firm, Collins plus Reed Architects, occupied a restored brick building with large industrial windows and a lobby filled with plants that Amara watered herself whenever the maintenance staff forgot. She liked the sense of tending something alive, something responsive. Her team greeted her with a surprise, a bouquet of calla lilies on her desk, a card signed by all 12 staff members, a tiny cupcake with a sparkler stuck in the frosting. She laughed, covering her mouth in embarrassment and joy. "Y'all are ridiculous," she said, though she loved every bit of it. Her junior designer, Nora, grinned. "You only turned 35 once. Let us be extra." The morning unfolded with a rhythm that soothed her. Design meetings, model reviews, a call with a community housing board for a project she hoped would become her legacy. She felt fulfilled, grounded, purposeful. But every so often, her eyes drifted to the corner of her desk where Evan's note lay folded, waiting, like a small promise she was trying not to grip too tightly. At noon, she finally received a text from him. "Big day at the office. Dinner still on. Happy birthday, Amara." Formal, polite, not warm, not quite, but something. A thread she could tie hope to. She stared at the message for a few seconds before replying, "Thank you. Looking forward to tonight." For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe with her whole chest. She didn't know, not yet, that the morning had lied to her, that the day had gathered beauty only to make the darkness sharper, that tonight would not be a beginning, but an ending disguised as celebration. For now, she held the note in her mind like a pressed flower and cherished the illusion of love returning. Amara Collins had always been the kind of woman the world looked at and said, "She has it all together." And from a distance, perhaps she did. Her colleagues saw a brilliant architect whose designs graced magazine covers for their elegance and sustainability. Her clients saw poise, measured gestures, composed eyes, a voice that could make even the most chaotic meeting feel like a carefully drawn blueprint. Strangers saw a tall, graceful black woman with impeccable posture and a wardrobe that balanced power with quiet beauty. But no one ever saw the hairline fractures, the ones that had been forming quietly, invisibly, long before the night her marriage cracked open. Amara had learned early that excellence was her shield. Growing up in Savannah, she was the girl who won spelling bees, science fairs, and architectural contests before she understood what the word architect truly meant. Her mother would stroke her braids and say, "Baby, some of us have to be twice as good just to be seen as equal." So she became exactly that, twice as prepared, twice as patient, twice as brilliant. By the time she earned her master's degree, she had already accepted a truth she never spoke aloud. Perfection was not a goal, it was survival. Her firm, Collins plus Reed, was born from that hunger. She had built it plank by plank, project by project, until it stood tall in the Chicago architectural landscape, a modern, glass-framed tribute to her ambition. Yet the higher she climbed, the more she had to carry. Clients who questioned her expertise until a white male colleague repeated the same idea. Meetings where praise came packaged with surprise. "You're so articulate." Industry events where she was the only black woman in a sea of charcoal suits and practiced smiles. Each moment was a small weight, barely noticeable on its own, but together they pressed against her ribs until breathing became something she did carefully. And Evan, he had once been the exception. When they met, he saw her, not as an anomaly, not as a performer of excellence, but as a woman with sharp angles and soft dreams. Their love had been a refuge, warm, honest, human. It was the kind of love that made Amara feel safe enough to let her guard down, to curl into the crook of someone else's certainty. But marriage had a way of revealing truths the heart wasn't ready for. Evan was ambitious, brilliant in his own right, but his success came with a restlessness she couldn't soothe. He thrived in boardrooms. She thrived in blueprints. At first, they balanced each other, but somewhere along the way, he began to resent the very strength he once admired. "You work too much," he had said one night, months earlier. She remembered pausing mid-email, looking up to find him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. "I work a lot," she admitted, "but I'm not alone in that." "It's different," he replied. "I feel like I'm married to a project, and I'm not the priority." She wanted to remind him of the nights he stumbled home past midnight, the canceled date nights, the last-minute trips he took without asking. But she didn't. She swallowed the protest, smoothed it into silence and whispered, "I'm trying, Evan." He nodded, but she knew he didn't believe her. Worse, she feared he wasn't trying at all. Little moments like that became their new normal. Not fights, not explosions, just drift. And through it all, Amara kept holding everything together with a grace so flawless, it began to feel like a mask sealing itself to her skin. Her mother's words became a mantra in her mind. "Hold your head high. Don't let them see you bend." She didn't bend, but she did crack. The cracks showed themselves in quiet ways. In the nights she fell asleep on the sofa with sketches spread around her like fallen leaves. In the mornings when she applied concealer, not to hide fatigue, but the grief of being unseen. In the hours she spent staring out of her office window, heart aching with a loneliness that felt unearned and yet undeniable. Her employees admired her steadiness, but they didn't know she sometimes stood in the supply closet just to catch her breath between meetings. Her friends knew she was successful, but not that her success had slowly become her only safe place, because everything else felt as though it were slipping through her fingers. On her 35th birthday morning, as she held Evan's handwritten note against her chest, she told herself the cracks didn't matter. That with one dinner, one evening where he looked at her the way he used to, they could mend the distance. That she would smooth the fractures, polish the surface, rebuild the structure of their marriage with the same precision she brought to every project. She did not know that some structures cannot be repaired, that some fractures widen only when touched, that the foundation she was standing on was already shifting beneath her feet. For now, she simply tied her hope around that note, the way one ties a ribbon around a fragile gift, believing the wrapping would protect what was inside, believing the day would hold, believing she could too. The hallway felt longer than it had ever felt before, an elegant stretch of polished hardwood and soft recessed lighting, usually calming, now transformed into a narrow throat of silence, swallowing Amara whole. She stood just inside the penthouse door, bare feet cooling against the floor where she'd left her boots neatly aligned, as if tidiness could anchor her in a moment coming undone. The overhead lights were off, leaving the space bathed in the faint bluish glow of the city outside. Chicago shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, cars threading the highway, lake waves flickering like restless silver, but inside everything was terribly still. Except for that sound, a laugh, light, feminine, slipped through the crack beneath the master bedroom door, soft enough to be mistaken for a memory, sharp enough to wound. Amara's breath tightened, her chest forming a cage she could no longer breathe deeply inside. Her fingers hovered near her collarbone, as if trying to quiet the desperate flutter beneath. She closed her eyes for a moment, hoping the world had misaligned, that fatigue was playing tricks on her. But then she heard it again. A murmur, a low hum of male voice, Evan's voice, muffled by the closed door but unmistakable in its intimacy. The room around her tilted slightly, as though the foundations of the penthouse had shifted. Amara placed a hand on the wall, feeling the subtle texture of the handmade plaster beneath her palm. A part of her, some instinctive, wounded part, wanted to rush forward, to throw open the door, to confront whatever waited on the other side. But she couldn't move, not yet. Something old and solemn inside her whispered, "Don't give them that scene. Don't give anyone that version of you." She forced her eyes open. The hallway stretched before her, dark, treacherous, asking her to choose who she would be in the next moment. She took one step, then another. Each movement felt both heavy and deliberate, as though she were walking into the wind of a storm that hadn't yet made itself visible. Her curls brushed her cheeks with each careful stride, grounding her when the air refused to. Halfway down the hall, she stopped again. She heard the mattress shift, a telltale rhythm she recognized in the marrow of her bones. A gasp, soft and newly bloomed, the kind a woman makes when she is wanted. And then, the words that hollowed her out. "Relax," Evan murmured. His tone was warm in a way it hadn't been with Amara in months, tinged with affection she had been starving for. "We have time." The woman laughed again, close enough to bruise Amara's composure, close enough to make denial impossible. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything except the truth blossoming before her. She wanted to run, or rage, or collapse. But she did none of those things. Instead, she stepped backward, retreating into the shadows like a woman pulling herself out of a fire. Her gaze shifted, not to the bedroom door, but to the office across the hallway. Evan's office. The place he guarded with too much convenience, too much insistence that she respect his workspace. A different kind of clarity washed over her now. Cold, steady, resolute. If she had been trembling before, the tremors eased. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, as if she were assembling herself piece by piece. She took one final look at the bedroom door. Just a door. But behind it lay the end of the woman she used to be. The woman who had waited for affection, who had bent herself for harmony, who had whispered, "I'm trying," into the void. Amara turned away. No confrontation, no shouting match, no demand for explanations from lips still warm with someone else's laughter. Her hand found the office door's brass handle. The metal was cool against her palm, grounding her, calling her forward. She pushed it open quietly, stepping inside the dim room where Evan kept the pieces of his life he never quite wanted to share. The door clicked shut behind her with a softness that felt like punctuation. Like the end of a chapter she had not intended to close tonight. Her chest rose with a shaky breath. The weight of betrayal pressed against her ribs, but beneath it, sharp, bright, something else flickered. Resolve. A beginning disguised as an ending. In the quiet dark of Evan's office, with her heart splintering silently inside her, Amara discovered that devastation does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits behind a door. And sometimes it becomes the very thing that teaches a woman exactly what she is capable of surviving. The office was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of the city beyond the windows, a wash of blues and silvers trembling against the glass. Amara stepped inside and closed the door behind her with deliberate quiet, as though sealing herself away from the world that had just been rearranged without her consent. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, uneven and uncomfortable, like the start of a song she didn't remember learning. She leaned against the door for a moment, pressing her palm flat against its smooth surface, grounding herself in the one thing that wasn't moving. On the other side of the wall, the sounds had faded into indistinguishable murmurs, still enough to wound, but distant enough for her to ignore if she concentrated hard enough. She inhaled through her nose, a breath shaky but controlled, and exhaled slowly, summoning the discipline she had spent her entire life perfecting. She had always been composed, always rational, always the woman who handled things with grace that felt effortless to everyone except her. But tonight, grace felt too delicate, an ornamental thing that shattered under the heat of betrayal. She pushed off the door and stood taller. The office felt foreign, even though she had stepped inside dozens of times. Evan kept his world here, his stacks of strategic plans, his black leather chair, his framed certificates that testified to his ambitions. The air always smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold coffee, a scent she once associated with late-night brainstorming sessions, when she'd curl in his lap and he'd kiss her forehead between spreadsheets. Now it smelled like distance, like a man who had carefully emptied himself of honesty. A tremor rippled to her chest, and she wrapped her arms around herself, not in weakness, but to keep her heart from spilling out in the wrong direction. For a brief moment, she imagined walking back down the hallway, flinging the bedroom door open, letting her scream ricochet off every wall of the penthouse. She imagined the shock on Evan's face, the scramble for excuses, the betrayal dripping in every syllable. Her pulse surged at the image. Because the instinct to confront was human, primal, raw, but she did not move. Something steadier, colder, wiser slid into her lungs. What would it change? The scene? Yes. The truth? No. Confrontation would only give him a chance to manipulate the narrative, twist it into something convoluted, clouded, painful. She had seen enough relationships crumble in firestorms of accusations to know better. She needed clarity. Not noise, not chaos. Clarity. She walked to Evan's desk, her steps slow but certain, her bare feet whispering across the hardwood. She paused behind his chair, feeling the weight of decision settle over her. Her hand hovered above his laptop, sleek, closed, ordinary. A simple object. But objects could hold worlds, secrets, answers. Her stomach twisted. Opening it would confirm everything. Opening it would break something inside her she might never mend. Her fingers trembled when she touched the lid. She swallowed hard, her throat thick with unspoken grief. "Do I really want to know?" she whispered into the silence. The question hung in the air, fragile and true. Almost immediately, another voice, deep within her, worn but unwavering, rose to answer. "You already do." Her hands stilled, her grief steadied, her breath softened. It wasn't fury that moved her. It was self-preservation. A woman deserved to know the shape of the knife that had pierced her. She opened the laptop. The screen illuminated her face with cold white light, casting shadows beneath her eyes, highlighting the quiet devastation forming there. The computer demanded a password, and her chest tightened with another moment of hesitation. If she stepped forward now, she couldn't step back into ignorance. But then she remembered the laughter, the murmured reassurance, the promise of time. She deserved truth more than she feared it. Her fingers typed the password slowly, almost reverently, because betrayal, even when anticipated, is a sacred kind of ending. The desktop bloomed open. A soft ache spread beneath her ribs. She stared at the rows of folders, the email alerts, the hidden corners of a life she had trusted implicitly. She stood still, her breath suspended somewhere between heartbreak and awakening. She hadn't cried, not yet. The tears sat behind her eyes like a tide waiting for the moon. But instead of unleashing, she closed her eyes briefly and inhaled. Choosing clarity over confrontation was not weakness. It was the first, trembling step toward reclaiming her own narrative. When she opened her eyes again, resolve rippled through her like a quiet flame. She reached for the mouse, her hand steadier now. If her marriage was ending tonight, she would not let it end in shadows. She would not let it end on someone else's terms. She would not be the woman who walked in on betrayal only to walk out with nothing. Tonight, in this dim office, with her heart fracturing silently inside her chest, Amara Collins understood that sometimes the strongest choice a woman can make is the one that doesn't involve shouting at all. It involves seeing, knowing, bearing witness, and then deciding what to do with the truth once she holds it in her hands. The cursor blinked at the top corner of the screen, patient and indifferent. It waited while Amara stood motionless, every cell in her body undecided between turning away and diving in. Her hand moved before her fear could vote. A few clicks, the practiced motions of a woman fluent in technology and order, led her to Evan's email. His inbox opened with a soft chime. Unread messages, newsletters, investor updates, nothing damning at first glance, only the ordinary architecture of a busy man's life. She could have stopped there, closed the laptop, claimed later that she hadn't wanted proof, that the sound behind the bedroom door had been enough. But Amara knew herself. She knew the way her mind worked, how it built structures out of uncertainties, and dwelled in unfinished questions until they hollowed her out. If she walked away without seeing everything, she would always be haunted by the possibility of being unfair. So she typed. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision as she searched his inbox for a single name, Lily. The results appeared instantly. Her heart lurched. At first, it was nothing more than a thread of messages about a design pitch, meetings, revisions, professional, reasonable. She exhaled shakily, allowing herself a fleeting, foolish hope that she had misheard, misunderstood, Then she scrolled, and the tone changed. The professional courtesy softened into familiarity. Inside jokes slipped between project updates. Compliments lingered too long. You always make things better just by being there. Wish this meeting could have been just us. Lines that wore the outfit of casual kindness, but carried the perfume of something else. She clicked on a message sent late one night, time-stamped at 1:18 a.m., a time when she had been asleep, alone in their bed, believing he was stuck in back-to-back conference calls with partners in different time zones. Can't stop thinking about tonight, Evan had written. You're dangerous, you know that? Lily's reply had arrived 6 minutes later. You're the one who kept looking at me like that. I tried to behave. You didn't help. Amara read the words slowly, as if they were written in some foreign language she had once known but no longer trusted. A cold numbness spread through her limbs, as though her body were politely excusing itself from feeling too much at once. She kept scrolling. There were photos. Nothing explicit, no nakedness, no graphic displays, but the intimacy was unmistakable. Lily at a rooftop bar, head thrown back in laughter, holding a drink that caught the city lights. Lily at an art gallery, her hair loosely pinned, a caption under the image. Should have been here with you instead of my coworkers. And then, Evan's response, next time it will be me. Promise. Amara closed her eyes, but the words burned against her eyelids. Promise. She tried to breathe past the sharpness lodged in her chest. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the familiarity of the language. Promises were what he had once wrapped around her. She clicked into another thread, willing herself to look, to really look. If she was going to walk away from the life she had built with him, she needed to understand what she was leaving. There it was, 3 weeks' worth of messages, leading up to a weekend she remembered perfectly. She had been in New York, presenting to a board about a community center renovation. She'd called him after the meeting, hopeful, wanting to share the small victory. He hadn't answered. He texted an hour later, swamped. Rain check on being proud of you? She had smiled sadly, accepted it, and gone back to her hotel room with takeout and a documentary for company. Now the emails filled in the silence of that night. Reservations at a boutique hotel not far from their apartment. A confirmation under his name. Lily answering, can't wait to get lost with you. Amara's hands shook, her fingertips tingling as though they had touched something too hot. It would have been easier, perhaps, if there had only been Lily. One affair, one narrative, a single crack to examine. But when she clicked out of that thread and returned to the search bar, the truth revealed its full, cruel architecture. It wasn't just one name, it was several, different women, different months, different excuses. The pattern unfolded with chilling, devastating symmetry. Each connection had its own flavor, its own tone, but the structure was the same. Flirting disguised as harmless banter, late-night messages, a shift from, you're great at your job, to, I feel different when I'm with you. Then hotels, secrets, lies. The betrayal wasn't in one woman's laughter behind a door. It was in the repetition, in the casualness, in how seamlessly Evan had woven infidelity into the fabric of his life. With each new thread she opened, Amara felt another piece of the man she had loved fall away, revealing someone she did not recognize. Someone who needed constant validation, who seemed to collect admiration like trophies, who treated loyalty as a convenience rather than a vow. And yet, even as anger simmered beneath her skin, another sensation rose alongside it, a deep, aching sorrow. Because buried within the emails were faint echoes of the man she had once known, jokes she could hear him delivering, turns of phrase she had once adored, self-deprecating comments she knew came not from confidence, but from insecurity. Evan had always been slightly afraid of being ordinary. Growing up in a family of overachievers, he'd felt that if he wasn't remarkable, he might as well disappear. She remembered nights early in their relationship when he confessed those fears, with his head resting in her lap, her fingers tracing circles on his temple. "I just don't ever want to be forgettable," he'd said once. She had cupped his face then and murmured, "You couldn't be, even if you tried." Now, reading his messages to other women, she understood with painful clarity. He had never stopped needing to be reassured that he mattered. He had just moved that need elsewhere, careless of the heart he trampled in the process. Tears finally gathered, hot and relentless, streaking down her cheeks. Her vision blurred, and she let it. She let herself mourn, not just for the love she was losing, but for the love she had given to a man who did not know what to do with it. This wasn't a single fall from grace. It was a history, a pattern, an entire blueprint of betrayal meticulously executed over time. As she wiped at her cheeks, she noticed a new message near the top of the inbox, sent just 2 days earlier. From Lily, subject line, 6 more months. Her stomach clenched. She clicked. "You promise you're really going to talk to her?" Lily had written. "I don't want to be a secret forever. I'm not built for that." Evan's response sat beneath it, confident and chilling. 6 more months. "After the merger closes, I'll file. We'll keep it clean, no drama. She's busy with her projects. By then, it'll just look like we grew apart." No mention of guilt. No mention of the vows they had made. Only strategy. Amara stared at the words until they stopped making sense, until the letters swam and reassembled themselves into something harder, sharper, reality. He hadn't just betrayed her. He had scheduled her heartbreak. Her hands went very still. Somewhere beyond the walls of the office, the city pulsed, and in the bedroom down the hall, fresh deceit was cooling on their sheets. But in this quiet, glowing space, something fundamental shifted inside her. It was not a scream, not a collapse, not the crumbling of a woman who had been destroyed. It was the reconfiguration of a woman who had just uncovered the full extent of the lie, and was, for the first time, beginning to see herself not as its victim, but as the one who would decide what happened next. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the city rising through the glass. Amara sat in Evan's desk chair, her spine straight, her breath trembling. The laptop screen glowed in front of her like an accusation. Her chest felt hollow, scraped clean by discovery, and yet beneath the emptiness, something sharper had begun to take shape. Survival. Not the frantic kind, but the steady, calculated survival of a woman deciding she would not drown in someone else's wreckage. She closed the email window slowly, as though shutting the lid of a coffin she needed to walk away from. But walking away wasn't enough, not yet. Truth needed proof. Proof needed protection. And protection, she remembered bitterly, was precisely what she had been denied the day she signed the document she now reached for. The prenup, a thin folder tucked into the second drawer on the left. Because even deception, it seemed, had a filing system. Amara pulled the drawer open. The folder lay neatly atop a stack of tax documents and financial statements. She stared at it for a moment, remembering the day she signed it, remembering the way Evan had held her hands in his, smiling softly. "It's just procedure," he'd said. "You know my family. They're cautious. It doesn't mean anything." And she, in love and so certain of their future, had believed him. She lifted the folder onto the desk and opened it. The crisp parchment paper felt heavier than she remembered. At the top, her name, his name, the date. A signature that once felt like a promise. Now it was a chain. Her eyes traveled down the clauses. A contract written with clinical precision, crafted to protect the Whitaker family's assets, legacy, and interests. It was a monument to their wealth, and she had walked willingly into its shadow. She read each line carefully, swallowing the rising bitterness. In the event of a divorce filed within the first 10 years of marriage, each party shall retain only the assets held prior to the marriage, with no right to claim marital gains, investments, or inheritances. Her pulse thudded once. hard. Their 9th anniversary was still months away. Every financial sacrifice she'd made, every time she'd chosen supporting him over growing her firm, every project she'd passed on because it meant leaving the city during one of his mergers, meant nothing in the eyes of this contract. To the paper, she was a guest in her own life. Her gaze sharpened, moving down the page. Then it caught on something, a clause she had not remembered. Clause 14b. In the event of documented marital misconduct, all aforementioned limitations shall be void, and the injured party shall be entitled to equitable division of all assets acquired during the marriage. Amara's heart stilled. Documented marital misconduct. She read the line again and again. Equitable division. Everything acquired during the marriage. Her share, her right, her protection. Her proof was sitting in the email inbox she had just closed. But with the clarity rose a darker truth, the legality of her discovery. She touched the edge of the laptop, her fingertips brushing the cool metal as if it were a fault line she was afraid to press. She had opened his laptop without permission, his email, his private information. If Evan's lawyers argued she had accessed everything illegally, the evidence could be contested. The clause could crumble. She could walk away with nothing, not even the dignity of the truth. A swell of fear rose in her throat, sharp, sudden, but it didn't drown her. Instead, she felt her breath steady, her spine lengthen, her pulse slow back into rhythm. Amara had never been reckless. She had never acted without thought. Her entire career was built on precision, on understanding that structures only fall when their foundations are flawed. She would not be the flaw in her own escape. Her mind began to trace possibilities, connecting dots, constructing a plan with the same quiet skill she used to design buildings that could withstand storms. What she had seen tonight served a purpose, orientation. But the evidence she would present later, it had to be clean, irrefutable, obtained in ways no attorney could dismantle. She closed the prenup folder gently, sliding it back into the drawer with a carefulness that surprised her. She wasn't angry enough yet to slam it. Anger would come later. Anger was a flame she had not yet chosen to touch. For now, she stayed with the cold, steady truth. Evan had built a contract meant to keep her small, measured, contained. He had thought she would sign it and forget it, and for a long time, too long, she had. But betrayal had a way of illuminating the fine print. She stood, smoothing her palms against her thighs. Her legs trembled once before her will quieted them. It was time to leave the office. Time to leave the laptop. Time to leave the last illusions she'd clung to. She opened the door to the hallway slowly, peering out. Silence. The laughter was gone. The murmurs extinguished. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they had left. Maybe their betrayal had already begun dissolving into whispers of guilt. She didn't care. The hallway stretched before her again, but it no longer looked like the path she had walked moments earlier. It looked like an exit from a life she no longer recognized. As she stepped forward, she placed a hand over her heart, not to soothe it, but to acknowledge it. It was still beating, still fierce, still hers. The contract may have been written to protect him, but tonight, in quiet, devastating clarity, Amara had rediscovered something far more powerful than any legal document. Her own resolve, her own worth, her own capacity to walk away, not shattered, but sharpened. She moved down the hallway, no longer the woman who had entered the office trembling. She was someone new, someone who would not be erased by a clause, someone who could look betrayal in the face and step into her own future anyway. The contract had been meant to bind her, but it had awakened her instead. Amara walked the length of the hallway as though she were traveling through the memory of her own life. Each step carried traces of a woman she had once been, hopeful, trusting, gentle in her belief that love could weather anything as long as she worked hard enough to deserve it. She paused at the threshold of the master bedroom. The door was closed now, silent, no laughter, no voices, only the muted hum of the air vent and the faint citrus scent of the candle she had lit that morning without knowing she was setting the stage for her own undoing. She did not open the door. She refused to give pain the satisfaction of spectacle. Instead, she looked down at her hands, steady now in a way that unnerved her. They were the hands of an architect, hands that built futures out of lines and calculations. They would not shake for this. Her gaze lifted to the narrow table beneath the hallway mirror, where Evan kept stationery embossed with his initials. Thick, cream-colored paper. Elegant. Expensive. A symbol of old money's fondness for announcing itself. She picked up a single sheet, then a pen. She carried them into the bedroom, not to confront, but to reclaim. The room was dark except for the glow of the city filtering through the tall windows. Their bed, once an altar of softness and promise, sat unmade, sheets tangled in a way that told her everything she needed to know without revealing a single, explicit detail. The sight struck her like a rush of wind, sharp enough to make her inhale too quickly. For a moment, just one, her knees threatened to buckle. But she stood, and she breathed, and she allowed her heart to ache without letting it collapse. She walked to her side of the bed and sat. The mattress dipped beneath her weight, sighing as if it, too, knew it was absorbing the end of something significant. The pen felt heavy between her fingers. She didn't plan the words. She didn't overthink them. They poured out with the fluid grace of someone who had stopped needing permission to tell her own truth. Her handwriting moved with calm precision across the page. Evan, by now, you know I came home early. You know what I heard. And you know that I didn't need to see anything more. A woman doesn't require a full confession when she has already felt the fracture. This letter is not written in rage. I won't give you that. It is written from clarity, a clarity I have avoided for far too long. I know about Lily and the others, not because I wanted to pry, but because the sound of laughter behind our bedroom door demanded that I stop believing in illusions. Tonight, I walked through this home and realized I no longer recognize the life you and I built. It has been hollowed out by deceit, repainted with lies, then staged for a clean exit on your terms. You planned to leave in 6 months. I learned to stop waiting in one night. She paused, steadying her breath. The words were not vindictive. They were simply true. She continued, I will not confront you. I will not fight for explanations you are incapable of giving. I will not cling to a marriage you stepped out of long before tonight. Instead, I am choosing myself. I am leaving this home, not as your wife, not as your counterpart, not as the woman who tried endlessly to make us work. I leave as a woman who finally understands that self-preservation is not abandonment. It is survival. By the time you read this, I will be gone. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I deserve a life where truth is not rationed, where love is a presence, not an excuse, and where I am more than an afterthought to a man who feared his own ordinariness more than he cherished my devotion. The version of me who trusted you died somewhere in that hallway tonight. The version who remains is done being small. She signed her name simply, Amara. When she finished, she read the letter once, calmly, slowly, as if imprinting the words onto her own heart. Then she folded the page in thirds with deliberate care, slid it into an envelope, and placed it on Evan's pillow. She positioned it neatly, aligned with the seam of the sheet, as if symmetry could soften the weight of parting. Her wedding ring followed next. It lay atop the envelope like a fallen crown, a small, gleaming monument to the promise she had upheld alone. She stood and took one long look at the room, not with longing, not with sorrow, but with the detached clarity of someone cataloging what no longer belonged to her. The framed photographs, the candles she picked, the books she stacked neatly on the nightstand, all artifacts of an effort she would no longer expend. Her exit would be clean, not quiet out of weakness, but quiet out of dignity. She gathered her essentials from the hallway closet. Phone, wallet, keys, nothing more. She didn't take clothes, jewelry, or anything that required hesitation. She refused to bind her future to the remnants of a life that had betrayed her. Walking toward the front door, she felt a strange sensation. Lightness. Not joy, Not yet. But something like the first breath after being underwater too long. As she reached for the handle, she turned back once, letting her eyes drift over the space that had held both her dreams and her disillusionment. Then she opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and walked away from the life she had tried so hard to keep intact. Down the hallway, her footsteps were silent, but inside her chest, a new rhythm began to form. One that belonged to a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to save herself. Evan Whitaker always imagined that if his life ever fell apart, it would do so in a way he could manage, gradually, strategically, with enough warning to spin the narrative and soften the blow. He had built a career out of anticipating risk. He knew how to exit deals before they soured, how to pivot failing investments into respectable losses. To him, disaster was something you could chart on a graph and outthink if you moved quickly enough. He did not expect it to arrive folded into a single sheet of paper on his pillow. He walked into the master bedroom, humming under his breath, fingers still working at his cufflinks, skin flushed from the too-hot shower he'd taken after Lily left. He smelled faintly of her perfume beneath the citrus steam. The room was dim, washed in the hazy glow of the city outside. For a moment, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The bed, straightened hastily. The chair still holding the jacket he'd tossed there that afternoon. The candle stub on the nightstand, long extinguished. Then he saw it, an envelope, centered precisely on his pillow. His stationery, his initials embossed in gold at the top. His breath hitched, a small, instinctive flinch he couldn't explain. The gold glinted faintly in the low light. Resting atop it was Amara's wedding ring, her simple band of white gold in their shared history. Something cold slid down his spine. "Amara?" he called softly, though he already knew she wasn't there. The apartment felt too still, the way it did when she was traveling, and her absence made every surface echo. No answer. He moved closer to the bed, each step shrinking the distance between him and the truth he didn't want to face. The ring was turned slightly, catching a stray beam of light, the inscription inside just visible if he looked closely enough. Always, even when storms. He remembered the day they engraved it. The jeweler had smiled at the phrase. "You expecting a lot of storms?" he'd teased. Amara had laughed then, that low, melodic laugh he'd once found so grounding. "I'm realistic," she'd said. "Love isn't the absence of storms. It's whether you stay." The memory stung. His fingers trembled as he picked up the envelope. Her handwriting on the front was steady, controlled. Evan. He had seen that handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards, on notes slipped into his suitcase when he flew across the world for deals she couldn't join. It had always meant something warm, something waiting. Tonight, it felt like a verdict. He slid his thumb under the flap and opened it carefully, as though haste might change the words inside. The letter was brief, not cold exactly, not dramatic, just precise. Each sentence cut with the subtlety of a well-honed blade. He read it once, his eyes racing, the meaning landing in jagged fragments. "By now, you know I came home early. I heard enough, not just Lily, the others. Planned to leave in 6 months. I am choosing myself. The version of me who trusted you died somewhere in that hallway tonight." He read it again, and then a third time. By the fourth, the words blurred. His knees gave out before he realized they might. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath his weight, the letter trembling in his hands. She knew, not just about tonight, about everything. The pattern he'd numbed himself to, the strategy he'd crafted, the timeline he'd convinced himself was fair. He had told himself he was being considerate, giving their marriage a dignified exit, letting things fade into something explainable. We grew apart. We changed. We tried. In his mind, those phrases had sounded kinder than the truth. "I betrayed you repeatedly and planned your heartbreak like a line item." Guilt had always been an unwelcome guest for Evan, and he'd become practiced at closing doors in its face. But now it walked in without knocking, settled in his chest, and made itself at home. He saw flashes of moments he had chosen to ignore. The time Amara had come home from a late meeting, her shoulders tense, and asked quietly, "Are we okay?" He'd kissed her forehead, distracted, and said, "You're overthinking. We're fine." The business trip he'd claimed was extended by a storm, when in truth he'd stayed an extra night with someone who called him brilliant every third sentence. The way he'd watched Amara sleep the next week, feeling like an imposter in his own life, then burying the feeling under another deal, another distraction. The room seemed to close in around him. He reached for his phone with numb fingers and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice came through, calm and professional. "You've reached Amara Collins. Please leave a message." Hearing her name unaccompanied by his jolted something in him. He swallowed. "Mara, it's me. Can we just talk? Please. This isn't... I can explain." The words sounded weak even as he spoke them. Explain what? That he was afraid of being ordinary? That every affair had felt like proof he was still wanted, still special, still more than the sum of his anxieties. He hung up, dialed again, same result. He sent a text. "Please, let's talk. I'm sorry. It's not what you think." Even he heard the lie there. It was exactly what she thought. Minutes stretched, thin and unforgiving. No reply. His heart pounded in his throat, the nausea of realization roiling in his stomach. For the first time since this series of choices had begun, Evan understood he was no longer the one scripting the outcome. His phone rang. His heart leapt. Amara. But the screen displayed another name. Mom. He almost ignored it. Almost. But he knew better. If she was calling this late, she knew something. He answered. "Hey, Evan." His mother's voice, usually cool and measured, carried a brittle edge. "I just received a very interesting call from Stephen Caldwell. His wife ran into one of your neighbors in the lobby. Apparently, Amara left the building with a suitcase and told them the marriage was over." He closed his eyes. "She didn't take a suitcase." "Oh, so it's better than that?" Annette's tone sharpened. "She left with nothing?" He struggled to find words. "It's complicated." "Complicated," she repeated, her voice cold enough to frost glass. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm standing, it looks rather simple. Your wife has left you on her birthday, the night you supposedly planned a romantic dinner, and she informs someone, who informs someone important, that your marriage is finished." Evan dragged a hand through his damp hair, fingers tangling at the base of his neck. "I've made some mistakes." Silence crackled on the line, loud in its own way. "Is there another woman?" his mother asked finally. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. Disappointment did the work for her. He exhaled. "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Just one?" He flinched at the precision of the question, at the way she cut through appearances without mercy. "No." He heard her inhale, a sharp, disbelieving sound. When she spoke again, her composure remained intact, but something in it had hardened. "Evan, do you have any idea what you've done?" His instinct, well-trained, was to defend himself. "It's not that simple. Amara and we've been distant. She's been married to her firm. Stop." The single word landed like a gavel. "I will not listen to you blame your wife for your inability to honor your vows," Annette continued. "You knew who she was when you married her. You loved who she was when you married her. Her ambition was not a surprise. It was the reason you used when you told me, 'She understands me in ways no one else does, Mom.' Do you remember saying that?" His throat tightened. He did. "Your father had affairs," she said quietly. "I knew about them. Society assumed I'd look the other way. That's what women of my generation and class did. I made my compromises. I am not proud of them, but I lived with them. I will not watch my son become a cheaper copy of his father and call it complexity." The word stung in ways he hadn't expected. "I didn't mean for it to..." "That's the problem, Evan," she cut in. "You never mean for it to happen. You simply let it, over and over again, until your intentions are irrelevant." He sank his elbows onto his knees, pressing the heel of his hand against his brow. "Is she going to file?" Annette asked. He thought of the letter. The calm finality of it. The line, "By the time you read this, I will be gone." "Yes," he whispered. "I think she already has a plan." A sigh drifted through the line, low and weary. "Of course she does. She is Amara. She does nothing halfway." Guilt twisted deeper. His mother's voice softened then, but it did not lose its edge. "Listen to me very carefully. If she has evidence, real evidence, you are exposed. Personally, professionally, legally. I don't care about you losing money. We have more. I care about the Whitaker name being paraded through the courts over something as avoidable as your arrogance." He swallowed. "What do you want me to do?" "Whatever her attorneys ask of you," Annette replied. "You will not fight her publicly. You will not attempt to smear her. You will not try to spin this into a narrative where you are a lonely, neglected husband. You will own what you've done and give her what she needs to leave you with dignity." He winced. "She's asking for—" "Let me guess," his mother interrupted, tired amusement touching her voice for the first time. "Half of what was built during your marriage? Access to property? A formal statement acknowledging your misconduct?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Then you'll do it," she said simply, "because the alternative is worse. And because, though you don't deserve her grace, you owe her at least that much." He wanted to argue, to insist the settlement was too much, that she was punishing him. But beneath that impulse lay something truer, the sting of knowing his mother was right. Amara wasn't punishing him. She was freeing herself. "Do you understand me?" Annette asked. He closed his eyes. "Yes." "Good." Her tone softened a fraction. "I know you, Evan. Underneath all your bravado, you are not cruel. Weak, yes. Afraid, certainly, but not cruel. Don't become cruel now to protect a version of yourself that never truly existed." The line went quiet for a heartbeat. Then gently she added, "You loved her once. Remember that when you're sitting across from her legal team. Let that be the part of you that shows up." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Okay, I'll speak to our attorney," she said. "Expect a call in the morning. Try to get some sleep." Sleep. The idea felt impossible. He hung up and sat in the dim room, letter still open in his hand, ring gleaming accusingly beside him. The walls that had once held their shared life now pressed in around him like a verdict. For the first time, Evan understood that there were some messes you couldn't spreadsheet your way out of. Some losses no negotiation could fully soften. He had gambled with a woman who had given him her whole heart, and in his arrogant certainty, he'd assumed she would always be there when he was done chasing proof that he still mattered. Now, in the hollow quiet of their bedroom, with only her absence to keep him company, he realized the truth with chilling clarity. He had finally gone too far. And this time, the cost would not simply be money. It would be the one person who had loved him before he felt the need to test his worth in the arms and eyes of anyone else. The law office did not care that Amara Collins's heart was broken. It cared about documents and timelines, about clauses and precedents, and what could or could not withstand cross-examination. The reception area smelled faintly of lemon and printer ink, and the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting hung just out of reach. Amara sat on a charcoal gray sofa, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the skyline she'd once imagined building forever with Evan. Now the same skyline felt like a jury, distant, unknowable, watching. "Miss Collins?" She looked up. The woman standing in the doorway wore a black pantsuit that managed to be both sharp and inviting. Her hair was cut close to her scalp, silver threading through the coils at her temples, and her dark eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen a great many endings and helped reshape them. "I'm Tanya Brooks," she said, extending a hand. "Come on back." Amara rose, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt, the motion automatic. Her fingers were cool as they met Tanya's, but her grip was firm. Tanya's office was smaller than Amara expected, lined with bookshelves and framed photographs of smiling women, clients perhaps, or family. A soft lamp in the corner cast a warmer glow then the overhead fluorescence in the lobby. "Have a seat," Tanya said. "Can I get you water? Tea?" "I'm okay," Amara replied, though she wasn't sure it was true. Tanya sat across from her, a legal pad and pen resting at the edge of her desk. She didn't reach for them yet. Instead, she studied Amara with a gaze that was both clinical and kind. "I'm sorry you're here for this reason," she began. "But you're here, and that tells me something important." "What's that?" Amara asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "That you're ready to stop bleeding and start building a plan." The words landed somewhere deep, where her composure had been struggling to hold. Amara exhaled. "I think I'm somewhere between the two." "That's allowed," Tanya said. "Let's start where we can." They went through the story piece by piece. The birthday, the note, the laughter behind the door, the shift to the office, the emails, the prenup. Tanya listened without interrupting, only occasionally asking for dates or clarifications. Her pen remained poised but still, as though she didn't want to capture anything until the shape of the situation was fully visible. When Amara finished, the room felt heavier. "You opened his laptop," Tanya said gently, "accessed his emails, took photos." Amara nodded, a flicker of shame tightening her throat. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you were trying to survive a moment that would have broken most people," Tanya replied. "But legally," she paused, "legally, his team could argue invasion of privacy. Anything you pulled from that laptop could potentially be challenged or even excluded as improperly obtained evidence." "So the emails," Amara swallowed, "they might not count." "Not in the way we'd like," Tanya said. "They're useful to orient us. They tell us where to look, who to talk to, what patterns exist. But if we rely solely on them, we risk a judge throwing them out. Then we're back to your word against his, and a prenup designed to keep you with nothing." Anger flared beneath Amara's ribs, not at Tanya, but at the sheer unfairness of it. Evan had broken vows. She had opened a computer. Only one of those things felt like a crime in the eyes of the law. "What about the clause?" she asked. "The one about documented marital misconduct." "It's real," Tanya confirmed, "and it's your leverage. But it needs clean support, hotel receipts, witnesses, texts from his phone that we can access through discovery. Maybe even testimony from the women he was involved with, if any are willing to speak." Amara's stomach tightened at the thought. The women she'd seen in the emails had been names and pixels, abstract betrayals. Imagining them as real, breathing people, sitting in a courtroom or in depositions, it made the pain feel textured, three-dimensional. "So this won't be quick," she said, her voice flat. "No," Tanya answered honestly. "It won't be easy either. His counsel will push back. They'll lean on the prenup. They might suggest you're exaggerating, that you're vindictive, that your discovery was unlawful. They'll try to make you look unstable or emotional enough to doubt." A small, humorless laugh escaped Amara. "So being heartbroken is inconvenient for the record." "It is," Tanya said, "but being strategic isn't." She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her desk. "Here's what you have that he doesn't," she continued. "A reputation built on integrity, a career that stands independent of his last name, a mother-in-law who, if I'm reading between the social columns correctly, values discretion over her son's ego, and a contract that, if we can prove misconduct properly, works in your favor." "And if we can't?" Amara asked. Tanya didn't soften her response. "Then we negotiate from a weaker position. You'd still walk away, but with far less than you deserve. And he'd learn he can orchestrate betrayal and walk away mostly unscathed." The thought landed like a weight on her chest. The idea of Evan moving on cleanly, unmarked, while she rebuilt from rubble, it scraped against something fierce inside her. "I don't want to ruin him," Amara said slowly. "I just don't want to be the only one paying for his choices." "That," Tanya said quietly, "is not revenge. It's balance." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Outside, the distant honk of a car horn drifted up from the street. Inside, a woman decided what kind of future she was willing to fight for. "What do you want, Amara?" Tanya asked finally. Not what's fair in theory, not what you think you're allowed to ask for. What do you want? The question startled her. No one had asked her that in a long time, without a blueprint, a budget, or a deadline attached. She thought of Cornwall-like cliffs she'd seen once in a magazine, of light-filled studios, of a life where her success was not constantly evaluated beside someone else's shadow. She thought of peace, of waking up and not bracing for disappointment. I want to be free, she said. Financially? Tanya asked. Financially, legally, emotionally, Amara answered. I want to know that the years I put into that marriage weren't just charity. Tanya nodded, something like respect softening her gaze. Then we fight for terms that honor that. We use the prenup as a starting point, not a sentence. We pursue clean evidence, and we prepare you for every attempt they'll make to rattle you. And if I rattle anyway? Amara asked, a whisper of vulnerability slipping through. Then you'll steady again, Tanya replied. With help. You're not doing this alone. Later, as they drafted the first correspondence to Evan's attorneys, the legal language felt both impersonal and deeply intimate. Words like dissolution and equitable distribution sat alongside marital misconduct as if they were merely logistical matters instead of the bones of a shared life. There was nothing clean about it, no swift, cinematic justice, just forms and filings and dates circled on calendars. Evan's response came within days through his legal team, polished, measured, defensive. They acknowledged the emotional difficulty of the situation, but questioned the validity of any alleged evidence obtained from his personal devices. They emphasized the binding nature of the original prenup. They framed Evan as committed to a respectful and private resolution. The subtext clear: let's keep this quiet, and let me keep most of what I claim is mine. Reading it, Amara felt that familiar pressure return to her chest. He still thought he could manage this, like a deal, like an inconvenience. But as she signed the bottom of a form that would formally open proceedings, she realized something important. The battlefield might be uneven. The rules might favor the one who had always assumed they'd win. Yet for the first time since the night she heard laughter behind her bedroom door, Amara didn't feel like the weaker party. She felt like a woman who had walked into a storm with her eyes open, not to destroy, but to ensure she would never again be left standing in the ruins of a life that had only looked like it belonged to her. The first week after leaving Evan felt like drifting underwater, everything muted, slowed, distorted. Amara moved through her days as if wrapped in a fog that clung to her skin, her breath, her very thoughts. She stayed with Layla, who lived in a sunlit apartment above a community garden on the south side. Layla's home smelled like rosemary, warm bread, and safety, three things Amara hadn't realized she'd been starving for. A spare bedroom became her refuge, its quilted blankets and soft lamplight a gentle contrast to the sleek, curated world she had shared with Evan. But even in that comforting space, the truth followed her like a shadow she couldn't peel away. Some mornings she woke before dawn, drenched in cold sweat, her heart thrashing against her ribs as though trying to escape her chest entirely. Other mornings she couldn't get out of bed at all. She stared at the ceiling, her breath shallow, her thoughts looping in a cruel chorus. How didn't I see it? Why wasn't I enough? Was I ever truly loved? She didn't cry often, not the dramatic sobbing others might expect. Her grief came in sharp, quiet bursts, tears burning down her cheeks while she brushed her teeth, while she washed dishes, while she sat on the edge of the bed holding one of her own sweaters that still faintly smelled of cedar. Layla checked on her without hovering, slipping mugs of tea onto the nightstand, draping a soft blanket around her shoulders, cooking meals Amara often forgot to eat. The kind of care that didn't require conversation. One evening, as Amara sat curled into the corner of the sofa, clutching a throw pillow like an anchor, Layla joined her silently. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer tidying cliches. She simply rested a hand over Amara's, grounding her with the kind of presence only long friendship can provide. And that was when the dam broke. Amara folded in on herself, A quiet collapse, tears falling fast. Hot, unrestrained, devastating. Layla held her, not trying to stop the storm, not trying to interpret it, just letting it be. After the sobs subsided, Amara whispered, voice raw, I feel foolish, like I built my whole life on a foundation that wasn't real. Layla brushed a curl from her cheek. Feeling fooled doesn't mean you were foolish. It means you trusted. And trust isn't a flaw. Amara closed her eyes as a tremor swept through her. I don't know how to be me without him. Or maybe I never did. Baby, Layla murmured, you were always you. He just didn't deserve front row seats. The words landed softly, but their truth was sharp. And something in Amara's chest shifted, a small, painful rearranging of her understanding. Still, grief wasn't linear. Even with moments of clarity, the ache resurfaced. During the second week, Tanya urged her to begin therapy. Legal battles drain more than your energy, she'd said. They drain your sense of self. Let someone help hold that part steady. Amara didn't want to walk into a stranger's office and unravel. But she did. The therapist, Dr. Althea Monroe, greeted her with kind eyes in a room full of plants thriving against the winter light. The softness of the space reminded Amara of quiet mornings before life became complicated. They didn't talk about Evan at first. They talked about Amara, about the girl who had learned she needed to excel to be seen, about the woman who had mistaken resilience for silence, about the partner who had kept giving even when the return was a tightening emptiness. You learn to hold, Dr. Monroe said gently one session, but not to lean. Amara blinked. I didn't think I was allowed to lean. Allowed by whom? The question sliced through her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realizations she wasn't ready to speak aloud. One afternoon, several sessions later, Dr. Monroe asked, what scares you most now? Amara hesitated. Not that he left me emotionally long before I left him physically. Not the betrayal. Not even the divorce. Then what? That there might be parts of my life I let him define, she whispered. And I don't know how to take them back. The therapist's expression softened. That fear tells me something important. What? That you're ready to reclaim them. In the stillness that followed, a breath left Amara. A breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, maybe for years. Her healing was not a neat progression. Some days she woke with a spark of strength, an untangled clarity that let her move through the morning with purpose. On those days, she returned calls, contributed to her firm's ongoing projects remotely, or drafted notes for the community housing proposal that had always lit a fire inside her. Other days, she curled on Layla's couch under a heap of blankets, staring at the wall while her grief hummed low and constant, like an old wound remembering itself. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift began. She started cooking again, not because she needed to, but because chopping herbs and stirring simmering pots made her feel tethered. She played music in the mornings, jazz, soft and soulful, and let it fill the cracks silence had left behind. She began going for long walks around the neighborhood, cold air biting her cheeks, her breath forming small clouds of possibility. On one of those walks, hands nestled deep in her coat pockets, Amara realized something quietly monumental. She was beginning to picture a future that didn't include Evan, not with bitterness, but with relief. The legal fight continued, relentless and often draining. Evan's attorneys pushed back predictably, challenging discovery, questioning her emotional stability in veiled, strategic language, suggesting she was reactive due to marital disappointment. Tanya dismantled their arguments with surgical precision, but the battle left Amara exhausted. Yet each time she left Tanya's office, she stepped into the cold air with a spine a little straighter than before. The breakdown continued in waves, but each crash left something on the shore. Clarity, identity, strength she didn't know she had. Breaking down was not failure. It was the excavation before rebuilding. It was the truth arriving in pieces rather than all at once. And slowly, as winter deepened outside and her resolve strengthened within, Amara understood what Dr. Monroe meant. Healing was not about avoiding grief. It was about learning how to rise from it. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes outside Tanya Brooks's office, drifting past the windows like small, white confessions. Chicago in winter had a way of revealing the bones of the city, steel and stone arranged in stark honesty. Amara sat inside that same stillness, fingers curled around a mug of peppermint tea Tanya's assistant had brought her. They were waiting for the next step in a legal process that felt endless, waiting for Evan's team to respond to Tanya's latest demand for discovery, waiting for something, anything, that might shift the balance toward truth. Amara rubbed her thumb along the ceramic rim of the mug, grounding herself in its warmth. She had become practiced in small anchorings, warm mugs, soft scarves, a hand pressed briefly to her sternum when memories surged too fast. Tanya entered the room with a stack of folders in one hand and a look Amara couldn't decipher. Not victory, not defeat, something in between, something alert. "We have a development," Tanya said, lowering the folders onto the table. Amara straightened. "What kind?" Tanya pulled out a single manila file and slid it toward her. "A woman contacted our office this morning. She came in an hour ago. She requested to speak with me privately. About Evan." A quiet tension threaded through Amara's chest. "One of the women from the emails?" "No," Tanya said. "Someone else." The words struck with unexpected weight. Someone else. How many fractures did her marriage hide? "Her name is Rosa Kim," Tanya continued. "She worked at Whitaker and Rhodes Investment last year." Amara nodded slowly, searching her memory. "I don't recognize the name." "You wouldn't," Tanya said, her tone steady. "She left the company 8 months ago, and she's willing to provide testimony." "Testimony?" Amara echoed. "About what?" Tanya folded her hands on the desk. "Power imbalance, inappropriate pressure, emotional coercion." She paused. "In her words, Evan pursued her under the guise of professional mentorship. When she tried to end things, her workload shifted, her evaluation soured, and eventually she felt no choice but to leave." The air in the room shifted, growing heavier, clearer. Amara's breath caught. "He hurt her. He manipulated her," Tanya corrected gently. "There is nuance, but the patterns align with what we suspected from the emails. And Rosa has emails of her own. Clean ones. Ones obtained through her company account before she left." Amara looked down at the folder, the edges crisp and accusing. Her voice softened. "Why come forward now?" Tanya leaned back in her chair, eyes thoughtful. "She said she saw a social media post about your firm's recent affordable housing initiative. It mentioned your advocacy work. She put pieces together. Your name, his name. She said she'd been carrying the weight of her silence and realized you might need what she could offer." Amara's throat tightened. "She's brave. She's tired," Tanya corrected gently. "But yes, there's bravery in her exhaustion." Amara traced the folder's edge with her fingertips. "Will she testify? Officially?" "She's willing," Tanya replied, "but there's a cost. Emotional. Professional. She'll need support, and so will her claim. But if her account holds up and her documentation does look solid, it bolsters your case significantly." Amara's pulse quickened. "Because it shows a pattern." "Yes," Tanya said, "one that is not limited to lapses in judgment or isolated encounters. One tied to power, to workplace dynamics, to misconduct that reaches beyond your marriage." Amara felt a mix of emotions colliding within her chest. Grief, vindication, and something new, a protective anger not for herself, but for Rosa. "He did this to someone who relied on him professionally," she murmured. "He did this to multiple women, Amara," Tanya said gently. "Some consented under complicated circumstances. Some believed him. Some hoped it meant something. But Rosa, she left her job. She lost opportunities." A cold, slow-burning fury curled through Amara's ribs. She had known Evan was unfaithful. She had known he was careless with vows and selfish with affection. But this was cruelty wearing sophistication as camouflage. "So what happens now?" she asked. Tanya opened another folder and slid a document toward her. "We add Rosa's testimony to our intent to use Clause 14b. With her evidence and her willingness to speak, we can request third-party statements from others at the company. And through discovery, we can subpoena internal communications related to her exit." Amara inhaled softly, absorbing the shift, the widening of the battlefield. The stakes no longer centered solely on her heart, but on the truth of Evan's character. "Does Evan know yet?" she asked. "His counsel will receive notice this afternoon," Tanya said. "I expect they'll respond aggressively. They'll want to discredit her, claim the relationship was consensual, question her motives." "That sounds like him," Amara whispered, bitterness threading through the words. "And that," Tanya said, "is why we will be prepared." Amara nodded, feeling a strange combination of dread and steadiness settle into her bones. She didn't want other women to suffer for her justice. She didn't want to weaponize pain. But pain shared willingly, truth spoken bravely, these were not weapons. They were illumination. Later that afternoon, Amara met Rosa. Tanya arranged for them to speak privately, not as co-witnesses in a case, but as two women whose lives had been shaped by the same man in different ways. Rosa entered the room timidly, her posture careful, her eyes wary. She was younger than Amara expected, perhaps late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and fingers that fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater. "Hi," Rosa said quietly. "Thank you for meeting me." "Thank you for coming," Amara replied gently, offering a seat. Rosa sat, hands clasped, gaze fixed on them as if afraid they might betray her. "I'm not doing this because I want revenge," she said quickly. When I left the company, I felt so ashamed, like I'd allowed something to happen to myself. And I kept thinking if I said anything, no one would believe me. Because he's Evan." Amara felt her chest constrict. "I understand." Rosa's eyes lifted. "I saw the news about your project in Bronzeville. The community center? It said you believed in building spaces where people could feel safe and empowered." Amara swallowed. "I do." "Well," Rosa said softly, "I didn't feel safe. Not with him. And I didn't feel empowered enough to leave without losing everything. I don't want you to go through this alone. And I don't want other women to think silence is the only option." Emotion rose in Amara like a tide. Unexpected, gentle, devastating. "You're not alone anymore," she said, "and I'm grateful for your courage." For the first time since entering the room, Rosa smiled. Small, fragile, but real. As the meeting ended, and Rosa left with Tanya to review her statement, Amara remained in the quiet room for a long while. Snow still fell beyond the windows, softening the city's sharp edges. She pressed a hand to her chest. Tonight, her heartbeat felt different. Still bruised, still healing, but steadier. Not because she wanted to win, not because she sought to punish, but because truth was beginning to gather around her, shaping a future she had not dared to imagine. A future where she was no longer the only witness to her pain. 6 months after she left Chicago, Amara Collins woke to the sound of rain on glass and the low murmur of waves folding themselves against a distant shore. Seattle rain was different from Chicago snow. It didn't fall with the heavy finality of winter or rattle windows like a warning. It drifted. It softened. It blurred edges and turned the world into something gentler, as if insisting that not everything had to arrive with sharp lines and harsh contrast. Amara lay in bed for a moment, eyes still closed, listening. No city horns, no elevator chime outside a penthouse door, no echo of footsteps in a hallway she once shared with someone who had never learned how to stay. Just rain, ocean, and the quiet hum of a life she was slowly, carefully rebuilding from her own blueprints. Her apartment overlooked Elliott Bay, a modest one-bedroom carved into the top floor of an old brick building that had outlived generations. The windows were tall and slightly imperfect, the kind that fogged at the corners in cold weather and creaked in protest when the wind swept in from the water. She loved them. She loved, too, the way the light moved through the space, soft and gray in the mornings, golden and hesitant in the late afternoons, the sun appearing like a shy guest who stayed only long enough to remind her that brightness still existed. Amara slid out of bed, padding barefoot across the worn hardwood floor. The air was cool against her skin, but instead of shrinking from it, she welcomed the sensation. It meant she was here, present, awake. In the small kitchen, she made coffee. Different beans, different mug, same ritual. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and stepped out onto the narrow balcony, pulling her sweater tighter around her. The bay stretched below, mist rising in soft ribbons. Ferries cut slow paths through the water, and gulls wheeled above them in lazy arcs. Everything moved, but nothing rushed. Her life in Seattle had begun with an email, a fellowship offer from a community design institute she'd admired from afar, an invitation to lead a project reimagining mixed-income housing along the waterfront. They'd cited her work in Chicago, particularly the community center proposal that had received press, and had written words that made her chest ache in a way that was almost pleasant. "We believe your eye for dignity in design aligns with our mission." Dignity, in design, in life. She'd read the email twice, then a third time, and realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. Moving had been both abrupt and natural. Chicago had become a city of ghosts, too many corners where memory waited with aching precision. The coffee shop where she'd first met Evan, the restaurant where they'd celebrated promotions, streets they'd walked hand in hand, discussing future plans that had evaporated like breath on a winter morning. Seattle offered anonymity, a chance to arrive somewhere as simply herself, without the weight of being someone's wife, someone's ex, someone's cautionary tale. At the fellowship, her days found a new rhythm. She spent mornings in a bright studio overlooking the port, surrounded by pinned-up sketches, material samples, and photographs of families who would one day call these projects home. The work was different from the glossy high-rises she'd once designed for wealthy clients. This work asked quieter questions. How do you make shared spaces feel truly shared? How do you build places that say, "You belong here," to people who'd been made to feel temporary all their lives? Amara loved those questions. In meetings, she listened as city officials talked about zoning and budgets, as social workers spoke of lived experience, as residents shared hopes, privacy, safety, light. Her sketches began to reflect not just her own vision, but the collective longing of a community. In the afternoons, she walked to the waterfront, letting the salt-tainted air curl through her hair, carrying away thoughts that had clung to her for years. Slowly, quietly, the version of herself that had felt flattened by betrayal began to regain dimension. One evening, at the end of a long design charrette, one of her colleagues, a soft-spoken urban planner named Lena, invited her to a ceramics class. "You look like you need something that has nothing to do with blueprints," Lena said, smiling. "Come. It's gloriously messy." Amara almost declined. Her instinct was still to say no to anything that felt optional, indulgent. But something inside her nudged differently. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Okay." The studio was a warm, bright space tucked into a converted warehouse, its walls lined with half-finished bowls and vases in varying stages of emergence. The air held the earthy, grounding smell of wet clay. The instructor, a man with clay-smeared hands and laugh lines, guided her to a wheel and showed her how to center the clay, how to lean in without forcing, how to let her hands respond instead of control. Her first attempt collapsed into a lopsided, soggy thing. She laughed, out loud, unexpectedly, and felt Lena laugh beside her. "You're allowed to be bad at something," Lena teased. The idea startled her. Allowed to be bad, allowed to experiment, allowed to exist without perfection. She came back the next week, and the next. There, under soft lights and the gentle hum of the wheels, she found a pocket of peace. The clay yielded and resisted in equal measure, demanding presence and patience instead of answers. It wasn't healing exactly, but it was a kind of breathing. She met Noah on a Tuesday. It was raining harder than usual, the kind of steady drizzle that blurred the line between sea and sky. Amara had ducked into a small cafe near the pier, shaking droplets from her curls, craving warmth before her afternoon sightwalk. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The room was cozy, filled with mismatched chairs, a bookshelf in the corner, and a chalkboard menu written in looping script. The air smelled like espresso and cinnamon. She stood in line, scrolling absently through a message from Tanya, updating her on a new development in the case. Evan's legal team had floated a tentative settlement, one that conceded more than she dared hope, but less than he feared. She was still processing it when a voice beside her said, "You're either reading something fascinating or terrible." She looked up. The man standing slightly to her left had rain-damp hair and a jacket that looked like it had seen real weather. His skin was sun-browned, his eyes a clear hazel, softened by an easy smile. Amara blinked, her mind catching up to the fact that someone had spoken to her. Why does it have to be one of those? Because that's the expression people wear when they're either planning a revolution or resisting the urge to scream, he replied. She huffed a small laugh. Maybe a little of both, he grinned. In that case, let me recommend the chai latte. It won't fix anything, but it makes revolutions and suppressed screaming slightly more manageable. There was no flirtation in his tone, just a gentle, open humor that made something in her unclench. She tilted her head. Are you an expert in crisis beverages? I work with marine ecosystems, he said. People tell me all their existential dread about the planet. I've seen what a good drink order can do. Ah, she said. So you're a professional witness to anxiety. He chuckled. You could say that. I'm Noah, by the way. Amara, she replied. They reached the counter, placed their orders, hers chai, his black coffee with an extra shot, and somehow ended up at the same small table by the window, rain streaking the glass beside them. Conversation unfolded easily, surprisingly. They talked about the city, about the strange comfort of gray skies, about how change felt both terrifying and necessary. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't pry. He simply responded to the version of herself she brought into that cafe, the one who was learning to exist in the present without constantly negotiating with the echoes of what had been. Later, as she walked toward the waterfront site, chai warming her hands, she realized she was smiling again. Not the tight, polite curve she wore in professional settings, a softer, inward smile, born of simple connection. In the weeks that followed, she saw Noah around the pier more often, sometimes with a clipboard, sometimes with a bucket and gear, always with the same grounded energy that made the air around him feel calmer. Their conversations remained contained, small chapters written in coffee shops and along the water's edge. They spoke of coral and community planning, of childhood summers and books that had changed them, of the strange, looping ways people tried to heal what they'd broken, in the environment and in themselves. He never tried to push beyond what she offered. He didn't rush. He didn't press. And for the first time, that felt like the beginning of something worth trusting. Not because it promised grand declarations, but because it didn't demand them. In her apartment overlooking the bay, blueprints pinned to the walls and half-finished ceramic bowls drying on a shelf, Amara took stock of her life one quiet evening. She was no longer the woman who had walked down a Chicago hallway, boots in hand, heart splintering in silence. She was no longer the woman who believed her worth could be measured by someone else's attention. She was someone in between and beyond. A woman with new streets to walk, new spaces to design, new questions to ask herself that had nothing to do with how lovable she was, and everything to do with how alive she felt. Seattle rain tapped lightly against the glass. The bay breathed in and out. And somewhere between the ferry horn in the distance and the whistle of the kettle on her stove, Amara realized that this new life did not erase what she'd survived. It honored it, by making sure it wasn't the only story she had to tell. 1 year after the night she left Chicago with nothing but her phone, her wallet, and a heart full of fractures, Amara Collins woke before dawn to a sky the color of pearl. Seattle still wore its gray like a favorite coat, but she had come to see that gray differently. Where others saw gloom, she now saw possibility. The soft, transitional light between what had been and what could be. Her apartment had changed. The bones were the same, the tall, imperfect windows, the view of Elliott Bay, but the space now carried the quiet signature of a life inhabited fully. Sketches and renderings lined one wall, pinned in careful grids. Some were for the waterfront mixed-income housing project that had become her fellowship's crown jewel. Others belonged to something newer, more personal. A pro bono design for a women's resource center in the Central District, a place that would one day hold stories like hers and Rose's, and so many others. The bookshelf by the window held more than architecture text now. There were novels with spines softened by use, poetry collections, and a growing section on trauma, resilience, financial literacy, and the politics of power. Between them sat small ceramic pieces she'd made, bowls and vases with intentional imperfections, each one a quiet reminder that beauty did not require symmetry. On the kitchen counter lay a slim folder, its edges smoothed by her fingertips over the past few days. The final settlement papers. The ink was dry. The divorce was no longer an ongoing process. It was an event in the past, a completed sentence, not an open wound. Evan had ultimately agreed to terms that reflected not just their shared years, but his responsibility. Half of the assets built during the marriage, a clean release from the prenup's restrictions, a formal written acknowledgement of marital misconduct and emotional harm, filed quietly but firmly in the court's record. He had not fought as viciously as she'd prepared for. Whether that was due to Tanya's meticulous casework, his mother's insistence, or his own belated conscience, she didn't know. She no longer needed to. The settlement had given her more than security. It had given her a choice. She poured her first cup of coffee and glanced at the framed document on the wall beside her desk. Not the divorce decree, but the incorporation certificate for Blueprint Forward. The name had come to her during a therapy session with Dr. Monroe. "You've spent years designing buildings," Dr. Monroe had said. "What would it look like to design a system that protects women like you from falling through the cracks of financial and legal structures?" It started as a scribble in her notebook, then a late-night research session, then calls to nonprofit lawyers, to Tanya, to Layla. Now, a year later, Blueprint Forward was real. Its mission was simple and radical: to provide legal referrals, financial education, and architectural consulting to women disentangling themselves from marriages where power and money were weapons rather than tools. Some needed help reading prenups they'd been pressured to sign. Some needed support negotiating settlements that wouldn't leave them uprooted and destitute. Some just needed to sit in a room and hear, "You are not insane. This is real. You deserve better." They ran workshops twice a month in a donated community space, a former church hall with high ceilings and scuffed floors. The walls were now lined with charts, budget templates, and calming art donated by local creators. On one particularly bright Saturday, Amara stood at the front of that room, watching women file in with tentative eyes and shoulders held too tight. Layla greeted them at the door with that gentle directness that made people feel seen. Tanya, when she could spare the time, led sessions on decoding legal language without losing your mind. This morning, they were hosting a smaller circle, a follow-up group for women who'd already attended the basics and were now navigating the messy middle of transition. Amara scanned the faces until her gaze landed on one in particular, Danielle. Danielle was in her early 40s, with a quiet beauty sharpened by exhaustion. Her first day at Blueprint Forward, she'd walked in clutching a battered tote bag and a prenup that might as well have been written in an extinct language. Her husband, a charismatic restaurateur, had convinced her to sign it for formality, back when she'd been working double shifts at his first location and dreaming with him about expansion. 10 years and 4 restaurants later, every business was in his name, every contract, every lease. When he began disappearing for days on supplier trips and then announced he wanted a separation, he'd assured her not to worry, she'd be taken care of. His version of care had turned out to be a modest monthly allowance and the possibility of a job as floor manager. No ownership, no equity, no recognition of the years she'd poured into building the brand. Now, months later, Danielle stood taller. With Tanya's advice, she'd found a lawyer willing to challenge the prenup's enforceability. She'd pulled old receipts, emails, and photos showing her active role in the business from day one. She'd learned how to read a cash flow statement, how to ask questions she'd once been too intimidated to voice. She'd also, with Amara's help, started dreaming about opening a small cafe of her own. Something intimate, something hers. At the end of the session, after the other women drifted out in 2s and 3s, Danielle approached Amara. "I got the call yesterday," she said, voice trembling. "We settled." Amara felt her heart lift. "And he's buying out my share of the restaurants," Danielle said, eyes shining. "My share. That's what my lawyer called it. My share. I walked away with enough to pay off my debts and enough to start over. For real." A smile broke over Amara's face, bright and unguarded. "That's incredible. That's yours. You fought for that." "I wouldn't have even known what to ask for if I hadn't come here," Danielle said, blinking back tears. "I thought I was losing my marriage. I didn't realize I was also allowed to stop losing myself." The words slipped past all of Amara's defenses. Something in her chest ached, but not the way it used to. This ache was full, purposeful. She squeezed Danielle's hands. "You didn't just survive him. You reclaimed what you built." As Danielle left, cradling a folder that contained the details of her new beginning, Amara stood alone in the hall for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. Rebuilding, she realized, had become a layered thing. There was the external rebuilding, the projects, the nonprofit, the speaking invitations that had started trickling in from conferences about urban design and gender equity. At one, she'd spoken not about betrayal, but about how the shape of a city could either trap or liberate the people who lived in it. Then there was the internal rebuilding. Her therapy sessions had shifted too. They were less about numbness and more about nuance, less about surviving the past and more about designing what came next. "Who are you?" Dr. Monroe had asked recently, "when you're not performing stability for others?" Amara had thought about the answer for days. She was the woman who walked in the rain without hunching her shoulders. She was the woman who no longer flinched when her phone buzzed unexpectedly. She was the woman who could sit across from a man she was beginning to care for, not with urgency or desperation, but with curiosity and a strong sense of self. Noah had gently, respectfully, woven himself into her life in a way that felt nothing like Evan had. There were no grand gestures, no whirlwind declarations, just consistent presence. A text after a big presentation. "How did it go? Proud of you already." A thermos of hot tea delivered to her office on a particularly raw, rainy day. Evenings when they walked along the water in companionable silence, talking about tide patterns and childhood dreams and the strange, healing joy of starting over later than you'd planned. She hadn't decided what to call whatever they were building. She only knew it did not require her to shrink. He didn't stand in awe of her strength as if it were a spectacle, nor did he shy away from it. Once, as they sat on a bench watching the ferries slide across the bay, he'd said quietly, "You always look like you're listening to something only you can hear." She'd smiled. "Maybe I am." "What does it sound like?" he'd asked. "Like a life coming back into focus," she'd replied. Now, a year after the night everything quietly broke, her life did not feel like a performance for anyone's expectations. Not her husband's, not the world's, not even her own restless ambition. It felt like purpose, messy, evolving, deeply, stubbornly hers. As evening settled, and the city lights stitched themselves into the fabric of the bay, Amara returned to her apartment, dropped her keys in the bowl by the door, and glanced once more at the framed blueprint forward certificate on the wall. She wasn't done healing. She wasn't finished growing. There would be more storms, more questions, more quiet nights when old memories knocked unexpectedly. But she no longer measured her worth by how well she held things together for others. She measured it, now, by how truthfully she could inhabit her own life. Not as a performance, but as the most honest thing she had ever built. On the night of her 36th birthday, Amara Collins returned home to find the bay shimmering like a field of scattered light. The rain had lifted. The city felt newly washed. The air tinged with salt and the faint sweetness of cherry blossoms drifting from the park below. She slipped off her shoes by the door, her body pleasantly tired from a day spent with people who had become her chosen family. Layla, Tanya, Lena, and even Noah, who had brought a bouquet of small wildflowers, he said, felt more honest than roses. They'd laughed, toasted to her year, danced in a kitchen too small for it, and filled her home with a kind of warmth no architecture could ever design. Now, in the hush of the evening, she poured tea into her favorite ceramic mug, one she'd crafted herself, a little crooked, a little uneven, but deeply hers. She curled into the corner of her sofa, wrapped in a blanket, letting the soft hum of the city settle around her. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, a message she didn't expect, and yet somehow she wasn't surprised. Happy birthday, Amara. I read about your work. I'm sorry for everything. For a moment, she simply stared at the words, blunt, belated, hollowed of consequence. She waited for a tremor, a tug, a sting, some small echo of the woman who once orbited his moods, his attention, his praise. But nothing rose inside her. Not pain, not longing, not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a quiet, steady emptiness. The kind that feels like healing. The kind that means the wound has finally become a scar. Amara lifted her gaze to the window. Outside, a ferry drifted across the dark water, its lights softening the edges of the night. She thought of the woman she had been on her 35th birthday, standing barefoot in a hallway, heartbreak pressing against her chest like a stone. She felt love for that woman now, fierce and tender. Love for how she had walked away. Love for how she had broken down and rebuilt. Love for how she had chosen herself when no one else did. She set the phone aside without replying. Some messages did not deserve an answer. Some stories did not deserve continuation. She reached instead for her journal, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote a single line. I am finally free. And she was. Free in the way a shoreline is free after a storm. Reshaped, raw in places, but undeniably stronger. Free in the way a woman becomes when she no longer mistakes endurance for love. Free in the way only truth, chosen courage, and deliberate healing can make someone. Amara closed the journal, exhaled softly, and let the quiet settle inside her like a promise. Her life was hers now, unborrowed, unbroken, beautifully unfolding. And if you've journeyed with her through every fracture and every triumph, let her story stay alive a little longer. Like, comment, and follow the channel to support more stories of strength, healing, and breathtaking rebirth.